the other two remaining presentation, and enough time for a Q&A session. At the end of the presentation, we will collect your questions. Each presentation will last around 20 minutes, but we're not so stringent in a way. It's not the terror of the previous eras. As you know, the Italian economic history, okay, that's over, so no more time restriction. So I pass the floor to the first speaker this morning, Francesco Ammannati, from the University of Florence, who's going to talk about this interesting issue, methods and sources, how to measure social mobility in Tuscany between the Middle Ages and the early modern age. Thank you all. I should receive my presentation on the screen. I want to say first and foremost that my presentation, as all the others, my presentation belonged to a full series of other presentations. And yesterday, this has been said by the first principal investigator of the project Social Mobility and Equality in Italy and Europe. And my presentation will be showing some methodological references according to the project itself, thus applying them all in a specific case to the case of the Florence countryside or Contado. So my presentation and the other that follows have the same methodology. I'm going to explain which are the critical issues, how to overcome these critical issues for data processing or gathering, and also this is also sharing the concept of socioeconomic mobility. By social mobility in the SMITE project, we mean the movement of the tax burdens of families from one economic status to the others. So upward or downward tax burden, or levy as to concerns the assets, distribution, or wealth distribution. So this presentation uses the data of the Florence Contado as a case study, one area that has been already studied on social mobility, as yesterday we already said. But above all, these data are focused on the movement of the elitarian groups, one part of the entire society. The SMITE project goes far beyond describing the trends of the entire population mobile social mobility as taxpayers, because the documentation we use is a fiscal documentation, tax documentation. Other studies that have been evoked even yesterday, studying the case of Florence, they find out other system of social mobility, social stratification, focus on the lineage of the family, having or not having offices, roles in the citizens' workshop or construction. So, and we've been working on that. So the case of the Florence Contado was 1,000 almost communities. So outside the walls of Florence, scattered all around. In this specific case, so we identified 23 communities, Prato being an exception vis-à-vis the other communities, rural communities. And also what was connecting all these Contado communities was having just one single tax system, calculated by the dominant Florence tax system that over time changed. Up to the 1415, the communities of Contado, they had to pay occupational tithe. The 15th century is the century of the famous Florence cadastre. Since 1427, not being discussed by me in my presentation, also having the same problems of the occupational tithe. And from the 16th century up to the end of the 18th century, the system of the tithe. These tax system were sharing or they added a different calculation of wealth, so bound to taxation. But on other occasion, we verify, we have seen this is not disruptive in the long period of time. Even though we have different several problems, we'll try to show this can be used for a long-run vision of this phenomenon. So for the register or tax register. So for the tax register, so we have some news of the existence of a tax register starting from the second half of the Duecento for other reasons. So we know, or at least we have some documents for 8 reviews of the tax register, 1350, 1415 for some communities, but also, I mean, in natural sources or municipal sources, some notaries signing the deeds, they kept these tax registers. So not in a systematic way, so it is possible to have some documents, tax register documentation even before such a date. Very useful for our understanding. So in a synthetic way, so what was I'll say the tax register? This was the value of the assets, but this was an estimate, roughly made. So real estate was the first item to calculate. And in a way, this was establishing the tax-paying powers of the family. And this is very useful. Also making some classification for taxpayers within the community. Was it a right rate? So maybe this was a right rate to calculate the wealth, the assets of the family. So according to these tax register evaluation, we also calculated the tax levying. So this is an example of how a sample of the tax register has been made. You see the breadwinners, the family leaders, or tax burdens, or families with people, and also the corresponding tax register.
Raccolta dei dati.
For data collection, we have just to see the tax burden and also the corresponding value. This is just a paper sheet just to understand which is the analysis, the attempts between one tax register and the other, 15 years, one before the other. The same attempt to connect the tax register or burden one to the other. Each column is different. So identifying, so the value of one here, and so on and so forth. Colors are needed just to collect these tax values. Another source, a tax source, which has been used for modern age, is the so-called tithe system, having another logic vis-à-vis the tax register. The tithe was a tax of 10%, which was applied on the revenue of real estate assets, but the house of residence and the structure of this tithe of the tax register is different versus the other tax register. These were registers. Each taxpayer was identified on 2 pages, left side. So we opened the account. We summed up all the real estate assets. On the other page, right page, all the real estate assets were just lined up by sales, inheritance line, or whatever. This way, since 356, there were some renewal of registers, but just material renewal. When the register was full, we changed the set of books. So since 1536, when the tithe was applied to the contata, to 1776, the date of the end of the tithe, we have to consider one single flow of data, which allows to have a snapshot for each year of the situation of real estate of the taxpayers that were just recorded or mentioned in these registers. A different way to register the data to see. That's an example of a thigh register. Left side, the real estate possessed, and on the other side, the other that were sold. That's the difference versus the tax registers. So once we identify the tax group, since 1536, it is possible to keep this separation between possessed assets and sold assets. What's the problem? So that's a problem about the figures of the tithe and all the tax register. For each tax register, Florence has established a sort some group of values to attribute to each communities. If we had to use the absolute value of these lira of a tax register, we wouldn't get comparable data. For this reason, and also for other reasons of making the analysis easier, the distributions have been splitted in quintiles in equal part in such a way to observe a fiscal group in a tax register within a quintile 1 is the poorest, the fifth quintile the richest one, and to see the movements. So this transaction not in absolute value but by quintiles. So the additional problem now is how to manage the so-called step distributions. Some tax share or rates having the same amount of money, the same figures. That's a problem of attribution to quintiles. If the tax register value is the same, why ascribing this to one quintile or the other? A problem of this kind. So second families, so the tax groups ascribe to the same quintile. This solution has been found just working a sort of reordering of these distributions in such a way to make the difference extreme between these two measures and to have an average of these two remarks. Quickly, I'm showing you the mode, the operational mode that has been used, the mode this has been done. I'm reordering this. This is done before using year 1. I took Gambassi as an example, and the tax registers are the one of 356 and 365. So for the first year, we organized the distribution of 1,356 from the poorest to the richest one, using the next year as a second continuation of order from the poorest up to the richest one. And then also we found the quintiles by families of year 1. The same has been done with year 2 in 1,365, using as a condition the increase in order of 1,356. And now we could also see the movement in this form of order from the poorest to the richest one, using the social mobility matrix, as we said with Prato. So the same operation to see which families went upwards or downwards or stable, and thus calculating the social mobility rate. That's the first part. And to have the second evaluation of with this reordering, we did the same, but this time using as a condition for doing this, the decreasing modality. Once again, reorder from the poorest to the richest one, increasing, going up, taxpayers of the first year, but using as a condition this time the reordering of 1,365 in a decreasing way from the richest one down to the poorest one. The same for the second year with the same matrices. At this time, it's enough to make the average of these two measures in order to get the total mobility, which is the summation of the ascending and descending mobility of the entire period of time. This way, we have the average of the two measures, extreme measures, being the consequence of the two reorderings from the richest to the poorest and vice versa, used as reordering conditions. This makes it possible, if it is applied to all the time intervals, to have the mobility, to observe the mobility, total mobility, and also yearly mobility. And this makes it possible to have some graphs, which in a way can give us a first indication of the trend of these 70, 65 years of the mobility, of the social mobility of individual communities. As I said, these work surfaces the use of data 23 communities. These are all the communities one shot. The slide is not clear. You can use some data processing, new ones, to read this much better. But the point is that in this phase we have another problem. We realize that some standardization yearly, so divide the total mobility of the period by the number of years. This can create some biases, above all in cases where the time intervals are very long and observation far away over time. In particular, the longer the period, the higher mobility between the two extremes, the two extremities. But within this period, there is the trend to underestimate mobility for just calculation-related reasons due to these calculating modes. So we thought the adoption of one model, linear R probability, I'm going to show you now. So I want to ask you to go back to one article which has been published by Guido Alfani and Nicoletta Balbo that use these modes. This is explained this in more detail. What's interesting to notice is the result. So, I mean, applying this model, we see that the marginal effect of an additional year of observation, this entails one effect of 1.3 almost. So once we get these parameters, we could normalize the length of the distribution of a period of 10 years and having one observation without this effect of distance between the two observations, finding the early mobility standardized. Well, an additional adjustment of these methods is also used in a different weight according to the dimension of the community. When we aggregate all data, also making a sort of ponderation work on the number of households. And this is the result of the graph with the adoption of these methods. So also consider impact of the length of this period of time, also of the averages, and also the aggregated data, taking in consideration yearly or 10-year averages. These help us to have a more clear understanding of this phenomenon. That's one case. I'll show you the operational mode for data gathering and retrieving. For the analysis, it's up to future presentations. All this, up to now, this corresponds to a mobility inside the communities. Movements occur inside communities. What can be interesting is to verify the movements between communities. So geographical mobility, ingoing and outgoing from the Cantado. This type of data is not available for all the communities and for all the periods of time. So geographical mobility is just observable in a few cases. But for some communities, lucky them, and for some periods of time, another parallel tool is the so-called breadwinners with the tax declaration, tax revenue declaration, aggregated by the communities and delivered to Florence. This makes it possible to get additional information about the movements outgoing and incoming. So this declaration, tax revenue declaration, shows, assets ongoing and incoming. So taxpayers who came in from the outside, who stayed in Florence, or if they left. Applying the same method of standardization to this data set, we get the general trend of geographical mobility, just starting from 1365, because we don't have data of this kind preceding the Black Plague. But it's very important to see that even though we don't know which are the levels of geographical mobility, the previous one, the next ones from the last quarter of the 14th century, a geographical mobility quite high, which is increasing over time, which is also in line with the other data that we already gather on social mobility. We mean that a certain time after a sudden acceleration of social mobility after the Black Plague, the situation is quite stable, and to find new opportunity was necessary to leave the community, to go away, or maybe whatever. So this was at the end of the possibility offered within the community. I'm just finishing this off with data of the tithe. So the tithe makes it possible to have a vision year by year of the status, the economic status of the properties, of the assets of the taxpayers, of the registers. So we see 250 years of continuous data flow. That's a table showing the possibilities of data processing since 1536 and 1775, 76. Not all the 50 years possible, but that's a process is done with the methods already seen, reordering the distribution of wealth, finding the matrices with the averages over 50 years. The result is just a nearly mobility, which has been shown by this graph, Gambassi. So the greatest community, the community of Gambassi, the yearly data, the pure data can also be but unstable in the trend, even though we see a decreasing trend. But this helps us to get straight to a nearly average, as this has been already said by Guido Alfan, showing just a decreasing trend of social mobility in the early modern age up to the end of the available data of the tithe, with the trend which is quite clear. I don't want to add on anything else as to the trend of economic inequalities. We have spoken of these, and I stop here. Thank you.
Grazie mille.
Thank you, Francesco, for this interesting presentation of how the sources have to be organized, analyzed, used as far as Toscana is concerned. Now we will move to Verona, because Benedetta Crivelli from the University of Parma will talk to us about the occupational mobility between late medieval and modern age, late Middle Ages and modern age. Thank you. Okay, maybe the title is wrong. Well, we will talk about occupational mobility. So this is one of the components for the measurement of the social mobility. Again, it is this occupational mobility. We have already talked about it yesterday, and I will talk about the case of Verona. Well, occupational mobility indicates actually the movement of individuals, families, groups from one social status to another. And in particular, with occupational mobility, we talk about intergenerational mobility, which is the social mobility of children in relation to their parents. In this essay, I will not deal about occupational mobility in detail, but we will see a model of the professional categories using comparing methods used, which is the ISCO system, for example, which we'll see in detail, which allows us to see professional categories, categorization, which is comparable among different regions. And this is important because this is one of the first cases of professional categorization in Italy. And we will see also the website, the site where we have all the categories of the ISCO, which actually, for the moment, does not contain information about Italy. So this is to be used to calculate the data for the mobility. So we need to calculate the intergenerational mobility, but also the intragenerational mobility. So the methods used in the SMART project, we have heard about that from the presentation of Francesco. So we need to consider the intergenerational, but also the intragenerational mobility, since we can create data sets in which we can see the different positions of the different individuals in two different moments of their life. in particular of the professional life. So we can see how it changes over time, in a time span of more or less 25 years, so within a generation time. So this is possible in particular because the source concerning the city of Verona is particularly suitable to this. We have tax registers for quite a long period, starting from the 15th to the 19th century, which is quite continuous, so without major gaps. The Verona tax register, which is the source we used, starts in 1405, which is subdivided in 3 bodies, city, territory, and clergy, and is quite complete but also complex because it includes immovable and movable assets, from which several liabilities have been deducted. See, the value of the tax register, as we have heard from Francesco as well, is exactly the ability to pay of the household. So, also to simplify the calculation of wealth, we decided to use as unit of measure the denarii. And this will be useful also later on in the presentation. So the tax register allows us to get important information about the family leaders. In particular, our sample. In our sample, we have 4 tax registers, 2 for the 16th century, and 2 for the 17th century, 1502, 1515, and 1616, 1635. And the important information are the one about the profession. So we have several data, and we have observed, using these 4 sources, exactly here we could find different percentages about the different profession. In 1502, for example, we have 43%, 34% in 1515, and even higher percentages in the 17th century. So here we can see a page of the tax register of 1616, and here we can see also that the indicated profession together with the percentage. So what we did, as in terms of analysis, we use the HISCO code, as I was saying. So it's a classification method. It's an historical international standard classification of occupations, which allows to create a code to gather all the information concerning professions and occupations within a unified system. So this allows also to use this information in different regions, also in long time spans. Since in this field of social mobility, this is a crucial element and needs to be delved into more in detail, so we tried also to organize a system giving us already useful tools and used already from the 60s. So the objectives, the aims, the goals are twofold. So from the one side, provide a systematic basis representing data in different countries to facilitate international comparisons, and also to provide an international standard of classification which can be used also for national cases, as for example in this case in Italy, for Italy. The HISCO code allows to get a detailed observation also of the single occupations, creating groups which follow the trends in history, and this is useful to the research. So the aim is to create this 5-digit code which allows as a codification, and here we can see that until now we use the first three digits, which allows us to identify the occupation. So we codified 167 professions out of 14,727. So this is an example, 570. These are the first 3 digits of a code. These 3 digits identify the groups, unit groups, monogroups, and major categories. So macro categories. This is an example. The profession, the occupation of barbarius, which is quite recurrent in the Verona tax register. So the barber, which has been classified as 57030. So the first digit is the major category, so a service worker in this case. The other 2 digits refer to minor groups, in this case hairdressers, barbers. 570, so 3 digits, in this specific case, identifies the group of the barbers, hairdressers and barbers. And then we have the profession, the last 2 digits, so 3 and 0, barber. Barber also has a hairdresser. So as I was saying, we used the website put at disposal by HISCO, International Institute for Social History of Amsterdam, which provides this information. And we'll see, as we will see, gives us also a scheme of the macro categories. Well, we also have to take into consideration some methodological issues. So the way the database is organized and created, in this case, we are talking about the database for Verona. So the main issues concern the context, the local context in which the different occupations are. So the consideration of the literature and also the different sources about guilds. So this is a useful information also about the different functions of the different professionals. Also about the guilds, which in the early modern age were particularly important, most of all in northern Italy, which in the 17th century redefined the function and the roles, also in reference to a generalized context of crisis, also given from the manufacturing system of those times. So this is also, to understand how the guilds were organized is also an important element. So another 2 issues concern the vagueness of the professional definition, or, on the contrary, an extreme detailed definition. So we have information about workers, tanners, so for the production of different leather products. So different objects which can also interest different professionals. So this is interesting above all in an international comparison. So we have different cases. We can have an extreme vagueness, but we can also have an excessive specificity in the use of the code, gathering and creating groups of workers, allowing a codification. Also in cases of, again, of excessive specificity, where we have differences, for example, in Verona, between different specific professions and different workers in the textile industry, in the textile production. So different workers for specific tasks within the same field. So, for example, you have very similar occupations, very similar professions, but which will be identified in different codes. for example, within the textile industry in this case. So all these issues concern, again, the cases in which we have very fragmented professions, and also professions which are difficult to identify and to describe. Another issue which is quite important, above all for the data we had concerning the work of ironsmiths, is, for example, the division between manufacturers and sellers. In this case, also the HISCO code created by the system gave actually some guideline. So a general definition of the occupation, originally including both manufacturer and seller. Another case concerns the cheesemakers, which was quite an important profession in Verona. In that case, the two subcategories of manufacturers and sellers have been divided. So here you can see some examples of major categories. We have 10 major categories. The first 3, so 987, define the manual workers and artisans. In particular, we can see the category number 7. There you have the workers in the field of textile production. Then you have food, the food industry, the food production. In category 5, if I'm seeing well, there we have the service workers, but also hunters, fishers are included there. Category 4. 3 and 4, category 4, there we have merchants, so sales workers. 2 and 3, we have the last representative categories, so administrative and managerial workers, and also clerical and related workers. And then the first 2, 0 and 1, there you have the so-called liberal professions. There you have, for example, artists, but also medical workers. So I will not go into detail in all these categories. I just want to give you some examples. Let's take, for example, merchants and artisans. Well, here we can see, for example, textile workers. Category 7. So I chose them because they were quite important in Verona. So these categories subdivided in 3 subgroups. So tailors, upholsterers, spinners, tanners. So in the tailors we have another division, as you can see, sartor and suitor. And then for the tanners, we have 3 subgroups, unciatos, pellippers, and another one. Very important is the issue of the textile workers, as I was saying, and also about the wool production worker. We have the carders, for example, and the weavers. As you can see here, they belong to 2 different categories. As you can see in the table, this categorization allows us also to have a picture of the occupational structure, which we will see later in detail concerning the city. And we can see also that between 16th and 17th century, we have a reduction in weavers, and this corresponds also to a crisis of the sector in favor of silk production, which increases in 1616. Concerning, on the other hand, the merchants, we have a major category, where the wool merchant, where we have the wool merchant, the so-called draperius. He has a crucial role, and also has the responsibility, the organizational responsibility within the Veronese wool mill. And which is supplanted by a series of different merchant categories with more detailed, more specific tasks. So before coming to the occupational structure, so to analyze the occupational structure, we try to organize the analyzed data, creating graphs allowing us to see the number of major categories for each quintile of wealth. So we used the method we have seen that Francesco illustrated, and we divided the whole estimated sample in rich to poor ranking. And we identified for each macro category, major category, how many professionals we have in each quintile. So therefore, we created these graphs, as you can see, allowing us to see, so which illustrate how in a pre-industrial society it's possible that the most representative categories are the manual workers, composed by manual workers and artisans. As you can see, artisans is a major category where we have mainly workers from the lowest quintiles, so from the poorest categories. So the less represented workers belong to the so-called liberal professions, which belong to the higher quintiles, actually. So from the 16th to the 17th century, we can say that the number of professionals in the categories 0 and 1 increase, but also the workers belonging to the lower quintiles are increased. So in 17th century, we have several professional categories, also in the medical field, which increase, but also notaries, for example, increase in number, but also workers belonging to the lowest quintiles. So we have tried also to find an average, average in the wealth for the different categories. And here we can see that concerning the categories 0 and 1, the average wealth decreases in the 17th century with respect to the 16th century. So from 416 denarii, it becomes much lower. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Benedetta, for this brilliant presentation and very useful. Also, thank you for your attempts of categorizing dimensions which can hardly be compared. Remain still the territories of the Venice Republic with Matteo Di Tullio of the Pavia University, who's going to speak about social mobility in Bergamo between late Middle Ages and modern age, sources and methods of investigation, of study.
Chiedo anche per favore di cambiare le slide perché non sono quelle corrette, se possibile. Vabbè, approfitto di questo momento.
I take advantage of this time for thanking all of you, the organizers. Sorry, the speaker has to talk to his mic. We can't hear him. Tell him to speak to his mic, please. The microphone, please. Thank you. I'm very happy to be with you today. And my research lays down in the SMITE project. Microfono, microphone.
No, va bene.
Usa questo.
Grazie. Ok.
Okay, now we can hear him. We can hear him. Thank you, thank you. So I said, I want to thank the organizers for this kind invitation, for giving me the possibility to talk. And as I was trying to say, this presentation and this research has been carried out within the SMITE project background. And the project leader was Guido Alfani, and I thank him once again for this great opportunity. The calculations have been shown in an impeccable way by Francesco. The calculation method of these projects has been shown by Francesco, so we'll not dwell upon this anymore now. I don't want to repeat what Francesco already said. Now I speak of the city, of the town of Bergamo, and before switching to the case study, I kindly ask you to hold on. And I want to try if I can manage using this. Okay, I need the laser, the pointer, provided I can manage and use it. I'm sorry. So I want to try now to, I would like to get started with some preliminary remarks, useful to make you understand the meaning of what I tell you now. Yesterday, Guido said this very well in his produzione, but the level of social mobility is also the result of the trend to the reproduction by one part of the community, the trend to reproduction, and the driver to change, which takes place in the pre-industrial society, coming from the more dynamic part of the society, merchants. So, in a way, these drivers to change, okay, now I can manage. So these drivers to change as an individual matrix, so drivers due to the will of improving your social status, I mean, individuals and households. In the pre-industrial society, it is like this. Or maybe this is the fact,
condizione generale di un effetto,
or this is a fact of a general effect changing the backbone of this community, this society, thus fostering the open up to mobility channels. There must be some shocks or some negative, positive, I mean, economic and demographic crisis, which can open these channels. In my presentation, I don't want to follow the individual choices, but rather I want to understand in which background this mobility channel can be opened up. If the Bergamo case can help understand this. Well, for doing this, and so to better measure mobility, okay, it is necessary to define what we can call social mobility markers. We should define some aspects, making us find a sort of categorization, hierarchy of the society. Better if these ones are measurable. Kulla, in the Problems and Methods of Economic History, find out 5 of these markers: wealth, wages, participation in political power, social prestige, lifestyle, consumption, culture, and so on and so forth. Some of these markers are easy to categorize, others are easy to measure. In our case, in the case we're going to examine now, I will take into consideration 4 of these markers, considering 2 categories. Okay, I'm taking into consideration using the tax registers. I will use wealth, which in a way can give us some quite good indication about the wages distribution in this society. And the second marker I will try to consider is the one of participation to political power inside the town hall council, which can be also considered as an excellent indicator of the social prestige of this society. So we switch to the case study, to the core, to the case study. So the Bergamo study. So Bergamo is a city or a town placed in the northern part of Italy. So at the pre-Alps line, having some characteristics to bear in mind. The first characteristics, it is outside the main trajectories, so connecting east-west of the Po Valley, because Bergamo is northbound vis-a-vis the main trajectories. Bergamo is not on the main trajectories of the Alps crossroads. So Bergamo is in a sort of unlucky position. And starting from the beginning of the Quattrocento, as you can see in this map, you see the administrative division of northern Italy, grosso modo, on the second half of the 16th century. The one in light green is the Venice Republic. Since 1428, between 27 and 28, Bergamo belongs to the Venice Republic. And since then, after the parenthesis of the Channel Wars, is on the eastern border of the Venice Republic. That's its geographical location. What else should we know about Bergamo to better understand what I want to share with you? I'm trying to take time in order to let my slide appears on the screen. I want to share some data on the Bergamo population. Some clashing data we have. Does the better reconstruction ever? You know, the death rate, the plague death rate or death toll is too high. But Bergamo, of the center, but Bergamo is an average size or middle-sized town. Bergamo has a population, decreasing at the beginning of the time period we observe for the effect of the transformations, political transformation, for the warfare that characterized that period of time. Then population went up continuously up to the beginning of the Channel Wars. Then we have the Black Plagues of the 16th century, many problems. So the population rate is a bit swinging. Then we have a decrease with the Manzoni Black Death, and then the population goes up again, and around the 1800, around 30,000 inhabitants. What I want you to notice of Bergamo, Bergamo has been built up on the hills. Behind you have the Prealps, and in front you have the Po Valley, and so the structure of the city close. So by these walls, you see in the drawing the walls, the Venetian walls, the end of the 16th century. The medieval walls were smaller, but the construction of the walls, so there is a strong difference between the urban districts inside the town, downtown, where the richest live, and the suburban districts being increased and decreased according to the demographic trends. And in suburbans, not only we have manufacturing activities, but also one part of the poorest people. That's just an evaluation, so which is a rough one, because according to this rough calculation, we see so those not having anyone, those who cannot take part in paying a tax. They couldn't pay a tax levied by the authorities. This was 1527. They cannot pay this tax for the building up of the town walls. The walls should be renovated, they said, and we use the tax register to see who's got the money in order to pay the money in order to restore the walls. These are not absolute poor, but these are in the suburban districts and not in the urban districts. Last but not least, and then we switch to social mobility. We can manage. So is the economic background to be taken into account. Bergamo is a city where we have different manufacturing activities, more manufacturing activities rather than merchants or mercantile activities. The city center has to compete with the valleys, Val Seriana Val Verbana, two valleys, very productive and very highly populated, competing with the city for the production of the wool cloth, which has been exported to Italy everywhere, the woolen cloth. And also in late Middle Ages, low-quality woolen cloth, because they exploit rural power laborers or labor. So the city of Bergamo has to compete to get the supremacy with the valleys. And the valley, the Po Valley, the local studies have shown the farming is good in the Po Valley, but the possibility of producing foods to feed a very highly inhabited valleys is relatively low, and so the valley, the fertile lands are controlled by the citizens of the city to the possession of the land. In some municipalities, some villages, almost 90% of the lands belong to citizens. When we see wealth distribution in Bergamo context, we speak not of urban, but we speak of urban and rural wealth distribution. Most lands being controlled and being recorded in the city tax registers. Which are the sources we are now using for this investigation? One of the sources, this has been said by me many times, being tax registers. So where do they originate from? So tax registers, as you know, are the result of the last bit of a long tax distribution system.
Ok, sono l'esito di un progetto.
This is just the ultimate fact of tax distribution system of Venice, which is mostly focused on two main tax payment sources. So, I mean, levies, custom duties by Venice, and direct tax system, gravezze, being in the hands of the cities. I don't want to give you additional detail about the distribution system. So what we're mostly interested in today is that at the end of this process, those distributing the tax to pay to the households. So, I mean, this is done by municipalities, and municipalities using the tax register to allocate taxes to pay. So tax register is useful for tax allocation, being used to define the wealth of all the households. And tax registers are also good to ask each household to pay the right amount of tax to pay. In Bergamo, we have good tax registers. Sometimes we got tax register with some amendments, corrections. Difficult to use them, just to track this correction on a yearly basis. But we can consider the beginning and the end of these corrections when this was possible, just to trend all the households at the different time periods. And for doing this, we use the corrected tax registers with the initial data and the final data of each household. So starting from this, so we created the famous matrices Francesco said already, and we made a flow chart. You could see, but with Alfano has already presented this flow chart in the Produzione. But this first chart should be showing you, confirming my point.
Un po' avanti. Ah, ok, no, giustamente. No, non è vero, eravamo giusti. Mi sono perso un pezzo.
So I lost one bit. I just want to show you, before showing the graph of social mobility, we need tax registers also to see inequalities, to make the inequalities trend. Now I want to show you something that partly have been already published on the book I wrote along with Guido. And Bergamo, like the other mainland cities, have a dynamic of growth of inequalities, but between the 16th and 17th century, Bergamo has a decrease of inequalities, which is the effect of that demographic trend, very swinging. These demographic swings, typical of this society. And also in this case, the general dynamics is also led by the dynamics of the richest ones. It's not a statistical need, but that's an empirical truth from a certain viewpoint. All cases we studied in contemporary societies, but also in pre-industrial societies, the determinant of the distribution level is always the richest classes. We switch to social mobility. For social mobility, what we do see is a sort of social mobility which is very upward or very high. At the beginning of the 15th century, we have a strong political instability in that period of time. So Bergamo is in San Marco hands. But this condition is not complete stability. However, we're just in a phase of strong change of the society. This situation profoundly changes in the 15th century and 16th century. Still, we have some mobility, which is relatively high in the last years of the Eternal Wars, even though this is not in Lombardy any longer. And then, stepwisely, there's decrease, and then we have this regrowth of social mobility, as Guido said yesterday, may be due to the fact that we are now considering a longer period of time. So the second point I want to share with you is municipal councils. When we say municipal councils of cities in this period of time, we have to say something which is obvious, useful to recall. We are in a cooptation system. You do not join the municipal council because you're very nice or because you're nice looking, but because we have a structure of the municipal council for cooptation within elitarian groups. But those who succeed being councillors, so are those being socially and economically important. So if you're rich and very important, you can just access to the municipal council. You will be a councillor. Also bear in mind the access this community number, 1428, the Venetians, the Bergamo Council. So with 62 councillors, so the office is on a yearly basis. It's nominated by the ruling councillor, a corruption system. Since 1993, some limitation norms have been introduced, and the 4% of the population grew up. So we have a minimum age to be elected. If you're being convicted, you can't be elected. Since 17, once the Venetians are back after the period, compass period, since 27, they started a new system. 100 councillors, 50 nominated every year, new ones, new councillors, and for each household, not more than 3 councillors, up to 4 in 1617. And this structure, roughly, is kept up to the end of the Republic of Venice. Thanks to some studies at the beginning of the 19th century, so thanks to the books of actions, where we report all the actions of the councils, we can know the composition of the city councils, and so we can try and see which is the turnover of these councillors within the city council. So I propose, following this model, Catini and Romani model, Guido was referring to already yesterday, I propose 2 measures for calculating this turnover. The first is an individual, quota, splitting the amount of councillors by the available seats. So 1 means we have a complete turnover, every councillor once for the entire period, 0-1. This means 100 councillors when we are at 172, always present over the entire period observed. When it's possible, I try to make some 10-year groupings, not only responsible for the sources, also try to calculate these individual quota by the amount or number of households. I tried just to reduce the individual turnover to see also the number of the families of the households involved. With this flow chart, so we have some surges, peaks of turnover at the beginning of the 15th century and during the Italian War periods. But always during the 15th century, we have a strong decrease of this councillors' turnover. So the economic growth of the second half of the 15th century, which is a generic growth and also Bergamo's, and the demographic growth they didn't produce any effect for the councillors' turnover. The other way around, so strong closure. So we have this disruption, and then in the 16th century, and then a new opening at the late 16th century, and some stability in the 17th and 18th century, in spite of the Black Plague disruptive effect at the society level, as you all know, and also from the economic viewpoint. Let's try now to compare Bergamo case with the case of other cities already mentioned yesterday by Guido, being the cities Catini and Romani have studied. Why these cities? Calculation being done using the same method. Otherwise, I would like compare carrots with apples, which is not good. Very interesting to see that finally Bergamo is a community with a turnover lower versus these communities in the 16th century, but also in the 17th century, even though it's the same dynamic. I want to ask you to note that Piacenza has a high turnover because one part of the Piacenza councillors are just, chosen so at others' will. So that's why we have this higher percentage. So that's why, this explains why we have these figures in the city. Last but not least, I want to share with you, that's a suggestion, something we're still doing now. So we're doing this now, is trying to put together mobility, wealth-related mobility and social prestige-related, or political power-related mobility. Now I'm showing the example of five households. Two of these are also being the Guelphs. So Venice, when the Venetian Republic comes to Florence, they open up, the city to Venice, not to Florence, but to Bergamo. And two of these being Ghibellines, so being just for the Visconti before Venice. So in a way, being just, the opponents of the Republic. One of these, instead, is just in the Cinquecento. What about this graph? So the blue histogram shows the presence, of course, in the council, at least, of one councillor, whereas the orange line, there's an average of the quintiles we have seen already. We use for the distribution. So I've taken into account the households with the same family name. That's a sort of an approximation.
But let's say in some way this allows us to aggregate a group of households. So at the moment, this data don't tell much, but we are about to use something which can be developed. For example, in one example of one household, we can see more useful information, even though this slight movement do not give particular indications. So to conclude, what tells us the case of Bergamo? Well, it tells us that between 15th and 18th century there is a general decline, both in terms of wealth distribution and in terms of participation to political power. And maybe in a city where the more dynamic social group, the one pushing more towards a dynamic mobility, the merchants, was scarce, is the reason why the mobility here is scarcer than elsewhere where we have comparable data. And then it tells us also that some particularly great shocks and also the combination of several shocks where we have demographic crisis, but also political instability seem to be the only factors, elements, which hit this city and remix the fates, so to say, even though in the modern period it seems that the local society learns how to find tools to be used to reabsorb more rapidly these shocks. So the idea is that, coming back to the original question about the social mobility channels, the channels acting on this kind of society are diverse. So we need to have a combination of different factors, because one only of these channels is a necessary condition but not sufficient condition for social mobility. So the wavelength of this alteration has to do with the capacity, the more or less capacity of the society, also as Guido was saying yesterday, to reconstruct the structures which enable to be reproduced again. Sorry to underline it more than once, but I find this is an important element. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Matteo Di Tullio. Well, these issues are really important ones, and we will have the occasion to discuss them more in detail. Now we have a 15 minutes break, so we will meet again at 10:30. Please be on time. Here on the table there are the forms to present your questions, so please take them if you want, and see you later.
Ok, sì, funziona. Sì, funziona, è qua. Un po' basso perché è basso, ma funziona.
No, però funziona. Sì. Riprendiamo allora.
So, here we are at our second part of the morning. So the first speech will be by Luciano Maffi from the University of Parma, the social mobility in the Lower Piedmont in the first modern age, the tax register in the territory of Tortona, sources and survey methods. Good morning to everyone. I'm not going to sit, I'm standing, since from here I will see you all. First of all, thanks to the organizers of the Latini Institute. I'm really proud to be here. For me, it's the first time this year. So it's very proud. I'm very proud to be here in this very important meeting for the economic history sector. So we will analyze one of the first tax registers concerning the Piedmont region, southeast, in the southeast area. It's an area close to the boundary between Lombardy and Piedmont. So in this area, as you can see in the map, also in the years I'm going to take into consideration, was an area close to several boundaries, and in the 17th century, which is the period to which the tax registers I studied refer to, was part of the Duchy of Milan. So this area was interested in the mentioned century by pandemic events, but also war events, since exactly for its geographical position, also during the Black Plague, it has been interested by a series of movements. So at the beginning, it belonged to the Milan County, and then, in 1743, in the Aquisgrana Council of 1748, it passed on to a different rule, different reign. So the tax registers I have considered are the ones of the areas you can see in the right side of the map of the slide, and where the locations where the population was more populous are the ones of Tortona, and also other communities around Castelnuovo, 7,000 inhabitants, and Tortona around 5,000. So this element generated also sort of competition, also because Tortona was papal seat, and also a big area. So we have also Monvisaggio and Castelnuovo. So I will develop these points in my speech, so concerning the sources, the political and social context, and we will see also specifically the aspect of the social mobility in the case of Castelnuovo Scrivia, and then at the end, my conclusion. So in the images you can see the Castelnuovo Scrivia in the modern area. Consider that before the Black Plague of 1730, as I was saying, this community had 7,000 inhabitants, and then in the end of 19th century, again, and nowadays it has like 4,700 inhabitants. So we have had a reduction in the population, and a significant aspect we will see also further on in the analysis in the 16th, 17th century, this place was specialized in the production of wood. The indigo, it's a dye used for, again, dyeing textiles, fabrics. So in the 16th century, this kind of trade started, this kind of monoculture in Castelnuovo. And then it became an international trade. This was a dye exactly used for fabrics, exactly. So this is the brief introduction. We have already heard about it by Francesco. The historiography will be dealt with in the essay. But I would like to underline that the fact that in the modern age, as we were discussing with Guido and others, there are not essays on the social mobility. On the Middle Ages, as Guido was saying yesterday, and also on the modern age, about the modern age. So the coverage of the tax registers, even though the data I analyzed do not cover the whole period, but they date from the second half of the 17th century until the 18th century. As I was saying, the area concerned is the area south of the Duchy of Milan, and these are the locations analyzed. So the sources I have used are of two different types. They are tax registers, but structured into different ways. So two different kinds of analysis for social mobility and inequality. So for this kind of analysis, we need consecutive sources which can be compared concerning household leaders, family leaders. So in the case of Tortona, well, in this case, we have a tax register dating back from the 16th century. And from this tax register, some books have been created after 20 years, but also after every 10 years. So this time interval allows us to reconstruct between 1633 and 1713 the process, as Francesco outlined before for the case of Tuscany, the process, the tendency in this time period. Here you can see how the sources are structured. We can see these are the first pages with some annotations with respect to previous documents. So through these kind of documents, we know also that there have been other sources which have been lost, also because the one of the 1633 refers to a previous source. One type of tax register, different kind of tax register, is the one of Castelnuovo Scrivia. I analyzed this case as case study. So these are very big books. Note that we need 3 of them to include all the data. So all these tax registers have one same characteristics. They allow an annual chronological survey. There we have the data, the properties listed. So the properties were listed or added. These are pictures of these books, and they represent in the long period 2 households. One was one of the most known households, families at those times. And the second one is called Gavio. The surname was Gavio. and we will see later in detail the division in fractions of commoners. In Terranuova, I will tell you the reason why later on. So the Gavio family, they belong to a higher percentile, and they owned a large part of Piedmont. So it was an important family in Castelnuovo. You can find their surname still in the area close to the highway exit. Sorry, this is something not dealing with our analysis, but still. Well, here, let me say, we worked in a difficult context because I worked with Guido in 2020. 2020, well, we could have access to the archives, so at those times I used to arrive in Castelnuovo. Here you see a picture of the building where the archives are. It's interesting also to see the beauty and the sumptuousness of this building. This building has been owned by bankers of the 16th century. They were bankers, but also merchants of wood. So I talked with the representative, with an operator of the archive, and he told me several events dealing with this historical building. So it was very interesting also to hear stories about this ancient building. Again, as I was saying, the social and political context is the one I have been talking about. So this is also linked to the economic aspect and also the aspect dealing with the tax register. So in the mid-16th century, the tax register of Charles V, with a quite complex procedure, we have seen the interaction between the center and the periphery. So the tax registers conserved also at the local level have an important role also to understand this interaction. As I was underlining before about the political changes to which this area has been subject, as you can see here in the northern part of Italy, and here later on where it belongs to the Reign of Sardinia. Well, through the different areas and dioceses of Tortona, I could track back also the trend of the population, and here you can see also the impact of the Black Plague of 1630, which is the period which we have analyzed in particular. So in those years, the population of Tortona could grow again. Also was interested by a reduction again due to some wars in the area. So concerning Castelnuovo, on the other hand, the trend is quite similar, as you can see, even though the decline of the population started previously, and also Black Plague has not had such a big impact. So here you can see that the decline in the population corresponds also with the decline of trade of wood, the wood trade. Concerning the choice of Castelnuovo Scrivia, well, I have chosen Castelnuovo Scrivia for several reasons. The first one is that, as I was saying, there is a possibility to analyze the mobility year by year, as what Francesco was saying, because this kind of tax registers allow to do that. We have a lot of data which have been kept, conserved, and also these tax registers are the result of a mediation between the parties of this community, as it happened also elsewhere, in other places, other studies, for example. As also Matteo showed us previously, so here you have wealthy and Ghibellini, but here you had citizens and commoners, or parts of the population more close to Piedmont or Austria. But this brought by the thing that at a certain point, two different tax registers have been drawn up. And also in the end of the 18th century, also the composition of the council changed. Given it the same level to the commoners and the nobility. Different classes of nobles had different levels. So this kind of consultation brought to the drawing up of these tax registers, with also kind of control of the mediation of the local community. So therefore, from one side to the other, they supported the methods of drawing up the tax registers. These aspects are not present in Tortona, for example, on the contrary, as I was saying. So both parties were constantly fighting to one another for aspects concerning tax registers and different tasks, the accommodation of the troops, for example, thing that in Castelnuovo happened regularly. So the tax registers we have concerned are the ones you can see at the end of the slide, but Anna analyzed in especially the ones dating back to the 17th century, from 1620 to 1680. And I created this annual analysis I described before, as also Francesco described. It's very similar, the method. So what emerges in this case, as Matteo already showed, we talk about mobility, but this data allow us also to apply the Gini index, and therefore to observe these aspects as belonging to the theme, the issue of inequality. Here you see economic inequality in Castelnuovo Scrivia, for example. And here you see a trend which is similar to that of other areas of northern Italy, studied by Guido, but also by Mattia Viale. And subsequently, I applied the methodology to analyze also the aspect linked to the social mobility in this time period. So in the 20s until the 40s of 17th century are the ones more linked to the Black Plague period. So in this case, we can observe how the plague of 1630 really heavily impacted on the social mobility, allowing for some years allowing this mobility for some years. So here in this chart, in this graph, you can see the reduction of social mobility in the years afterwards, and in particular in the 18th century. To sum up, maybe I was a bit quicker than the others, but this is a very specific case. So substantially, the role of the epidemics shows as even in an essentially rural community, these aspects of social mobility were impacted by this kind of events. So in the case of Castelnuovo Scrivia and Tortona, it is possible for the same period to observe. So we could also analyze the role of the military situation and their impact on these territories in the case of the wars of Montferrat and also of the wars of French and Spanish wars. So substantially, as I was saying, mobility in the case of Castelnuovo is strongly linked to these 2 decades, which is because in the previous and subsequent period, we can see a lower mobility. So I focused actually on these aspects for this analysis, but in the case of Castelnuovo, but similar data can be gathered also concerning Tortona and the other small community I have mentioned, Castellarponzano and others, which are located on the hills. On the contrary, Tortona and Castelnuovo are located in the Po Valley. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Luciano Maffi, for this presentation, focusing on a portion of the territory special also from the viewpoint of census, task censuses. Now the last presenter this morning, Mattia Viale from Padua, and we go back to the Republic of Venice.
In rural areas during the pre-industrial era.
Okay. In my presentation, I will try to focus on the tax registers of Vicenza, because the Republic of Venice has been studied, as you've already seen, with the city of Verona, and also we've seen the city of Bergamo. But for the start of social mobility, the territory of Vicenza is very rich in sources. The region of Vicenza is one of the most important tax registers ever of the Republic. 1,000 registered just for rural communities from the second half of the 16th up to the end of the 17th century. Even during the transit French period, the Habsburg domination also has been studied. So they levy taxes from the Republic of Venice, and the quality of these tax registers is great. We have a lot of communities with tax registers with annual corrections. When I went to Vicenza, I found this great amount of sources, the richest ever of the Republic, and I asked myself, why do we have so many tax registers well preserved? 1,000 envelopes in the state archives, others are kept inside the historical municipal communities registers. And I had to go back all to these tax registers. Why? Why Vicenza is so rich in tax registers? We have to take a step backward and to study the historical development. 1404, Vicenza is offering its faithfulness to Venice. This is the test of this faithfulness in a period when Venice is constructing its Italic state with the expansion and the conquest of Treviso. At the beginning of the 15th century, we have the conquest of Padua, Verona, and then Bergamo and Brescia. So Venice at this time was just a maritime empire. At the very beginning, Venice makes the federal state, the Italian state. So still, the capital of the state not touching all the privileges the several communities had conquered. So guaranteed these privileges over the previous centuries. The situation of Vicenza is a special one. Vicenza was never the capital of a lordship. Vicenza is between Padua and Verona, two of the most inhabited towns of the northern eastern part of Italy, under the domination of Padua, and then under the domination of the Scaligiuri family, and then under the Visconti family. That's why we will have the war with Venice. So Venice is continually, controlled or dominated by foreign powers. So Padua and Vicenza, they were very attentive, keeping under control the elite of Vicenza. And so the territory, so is free to move all around. And these mountain area rich in natural resources and water springs, these area later on in the late 18th century and the 19th century, this will be the beating heart of the industrial development of the Veneto region. So he said these communities of the mountain area and of the entire Contado, they can flourish from the demographic viewpoint and also from the social and political viewpoints. On the second half of the 14th century, at least we have 200 rural communities in the entire Vicenza region, and the population will be increasing in the mountainside, in the mountain areas. We have the colonization of the three Alps of the Veneto region. So the highland of Asiago is for the first time known, and some of the noble families of this area, mountain area, they are so rich and so potent, so they are just allowed into the council of Vicenza. The Velo family of the Vicenza area, they can join the Vicenza council, town council. So Venice reaches the mainland, reaches, Vicenza, and in Vicenza we have just a Sicilian group. We have one elite in Vicenza, but also we have strong powers also inside the Contado. And so Venice is socially keeping this balance unchanged. So for those being more familiar with this topic, with the history of the north and eastern part of Italy, the Asiago highland will be independent forever. There will be a separate division of these 7 municipalities. Marostica and Roviga will be freestanding entities versus Vicenza. So Venice does not touch on this balance, rather keeping this steady. So in this phase, the presence of Venice in the region, in the entire mainland, is quite light, the presence. We don't have a strong will of imposing its power in this region. So the communities, the rural communities of Vicenza, can keep this development process from the demographic viewpoint and social viewpoint and political viewpoint, and also they start being the points of reference in the territory for Venice. And this is very clear on the second half of the 16th century, before with the Italian wars, and then with the loss of the Venetian Empire, harbors in Albania, in Puglia, and in Cyprus. So Venice is deprived of the jewels of its own empire, maritime empire. So Venice has to reset its assets, going to the mainland. So mainland in Veneto region, to collect taxes, to make the states work, we need money. We don't have money anymore from Cyprus, so we're going to look for this money on the mainland, inside the Veneto region. So they had to build up a power structure more consistent, more present, stronger in a way, more substantial. And that's why, finally, we're going to see good sources as well from the tax register's viewpoint in Vicenza. Venice, does not use Vicenza to collect money. in Vicenza territory, but rather it promotes the territorial, tax system with some, troubles with the city elite, accusing they do, what the people from Venice want them to do. But what we do have is the creation of a new jurisdiction controlling the Vicenza Contado run by these people, the distrettuali, and the management is very strong from the viewpoint of tax system. In this period, and in the 17th century, so the territorial contado is autonomous for levying taxes and for tax collection. So now we have the territorial, contest, the magistracy decide the percentage to allocate to single communities, but also individual communities decide how to pay. So we have a new development of the tax register. So we have a development of the Vicenza territorial communities with the establishment of high-quality tax registers. Here we go. So not only the communities were free to decide how much to tax some lands, some properties. We decide the tax rate for land properties, another tax rate for renting, so landed properties. Also, we see the names of the people. Sometimes also they wanted to levy tax on the wheels of a mill. Each community is free to do whatever it wants to do, but also freedom for the update of these tax registers. So we have communities decided to update these tax registers from time to time, every 5, 10 years, even longer, up to 12 years sometimes. But also have communities that desire to use a sort of, longer procedure. So every year, the family leader was met. The representatives of the community, showing a sort of policy, and this policy is just written down in the tax register. And we also have top quality sources. These are the communities for which we have updated tax registers so for 50 years in a row, because we have communities. So freedom was maximum freedom. So we have communities that choose yearly updates for 2 or 3 years. Then they feel a bit tired. Then they made the update after 5 or 10 years, just for 50 years in a row. So the most meaningful case is Valle dei Signore, so upright. So we have the same tax register for 175 years. So we can follow the trajectory of one single household, family group, as such, understood as such by those writing the tax register, and this can be done over 175 years. How are these tax registers? That's a tax register from San Vito. I'm going to use this case history to show what we can do with these documents. We have the name of the taxpayer. We have so is estimal, so the tax register value, and then we have amendments or corrections. So you show the new year. This time we know changes within the assets for the wealth of this taxpayer, and so finally they confirm the same wealth and the same value. But thanks to these amendments, we can have some Excel sheets, and so we have households increasing or decreasing their properties, their assets every year. And thanks to these sources, we can trace out the economic history of these households for a significant amount of years. The methodology has been explained very well by Francesco, so I will not dwell upon these anymore now. Mobility index, so these are the quintiles, the same results. And let's get started with Sambito. Sambito, that's a dichiarato of the mountain region for proto-industrial development, one of the most inhabited centers. That the second half of the 16th century, almost 1,000 inhabitants. Before the plague, 450 households. So we can see year by year the trend of this inequality, economic inequality, thanks to the Gini index. So we have a trend of social inequality increase. That is Sambito main case. So these olds are the change of tax registers. So, but we have a sort of continuous line since 1541 up to 1665. We have a sharp increase and then a sort of stability as to economic inequalities on the second half of the 16th century, then the increase of social inequality in the second half of the 16th century, and then a sort of stagnation, stability at the beginning of the 16th, and then we have a huge drop, a huge shrinkage. This has been reported by Matteo and Guido in their book. But thanks to these annual amendments, we can monitor, we can trace out the trend year after year of many places, rural areas of the Vicenza region. As Francesco already said, if we go and see the tax registers, we're something, a sort of swing, you know, we're just to study very well year by year. We've just to level up these data if you want. So we have a light trend to a sort of decrease of social mobility. And as Guido already said yesterday, I know this occurs. We know this happens for the great or the big socioeconomic shocks. So we went to the OCC's archive in Vicenza, and we've been browsing, and this archive is run in a quite debatable way, but we have the register of the deaths of the 17th century Black Death. We have just a peak, the deaths, 30, 40 deaths in Sambito, with the 1700, Black paid more than 250 deaths. What about the effect of this great demographic shock on social mobility? So ultimately, not so much. It's not a great shock. We have just a surge, a peak of social mobility. You see this dotted line, darker. We have the upward mobility in the period after the plague. We have a surge of social mobility after the plague of 1630, but in the next period, everything seems to go back to normal. This is not adjusted data, that's the yearly frequency rate. So the plague is not a sort of upward social mobility driver like the Black Plague had. This is not happening with the 1700 plague, and not the rural communities are affected by this. This was a case study, but just to show you the quality of data we have for this territory, due to its special historical development, for these peculiarities. Thank you.
Grazie a Mattia Viale che ci ha
Mattia Viale, because you have shown a quite interesting case, very interesting case, and vivid. So these presentations are closed. Now we launch the discussion. If you've got some questions.
Al dibattito, alle discussioni, io direi.
Now I believe we can just collect first all the questions to be asked, and then speakers will have time to answer these questions.
Rispondere. Io per adesso ne ho.
I have questions for three speakers.
Raccogliere sia, ecco, Katia, grazie mille, io poi tengo un ordine, diciamo, di
So I'm just trying to respect the order for asking the question. Depends on the time you presented your question to me.
Ecco, diciamo, sfruttando il ruolo di presidente.
So, as the chair of the session, that's an exorbitant privilege which is given in case we have an exchange of role. I'm asking all the speakers to be, please make clear the type of wealth being taxed by the tax registers. For Tuscany, we have several cases for Tuscany. We know Francesco is going to confirm the tax registers in Tuscany, they had a special compensation for movable and movable assets. For Milan, instead, the tax register, the general of 1558 by Charles V, is done just for immovable assets. Just for immovable assets. For movable assets, this will require long dispute, long negotiation, and the result is not about the tax register, but this will be done according to the state judgment, measuring levies, duties, and this will keep as such for a long period of time. Now we speak of social mobility instead, and one of the driver of social mobility, there's a part I know, the 16th and 17th century disease focused on financial wealth, mercantile wealth, not landed property wealth. That's important to know why there is no mobility. If we look at the tax register just for, immovable assets after the plague. So this is a sort of observation, a detail I had to raise for these so different, audience. Now I pass the floor to Maria Fusaro.
Sì, direi che magari puoi con quel microfono. Sì.
Yes, it works. So, speak in English, and so I shall. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to actually see all the fantastic data and to have confirmed once again that the Republic of Venice is the center of the planet, as we all knew. So I have a question that I've actually, more than a question, is a suggestion. The questions come from my complete ignorance of some of these elements to Benedetta. But then it leads, in a sense, to a point that I hope the president of the session would allow me to make in terms of a point made by Matteo. It's about the importance of sort of institutional change and political effect on labeling and therefore the way in which then we select and analyze quantitative data. It comes from my experience in which I was realizing that when a specific nomiker or category disappeared from the historical sources, there was normally a change in taxation. Therefore, using certain words or certain labels or adding certain data had an obvious negative effect for the person declaring. So going back to your disappearance of Draperius from 1605, I think you mentioned, what I'm wondering is whether it wouldn't be good and it would be fun for the team, even though the project I think is just finished, to do some qualitative micro-studies of specific categories that appear into the fiscal evidence and see whether the change of name corresponds to changes in, tax and elements like that. Because I've noticed, for example, in terms of maritime history, there are places in which all of a sudden tonnage disappears, and then you realize that a small tax in another element about port management is now on tonnage. So everyone forgets to mention tonnage. So that business of, well, fiscal evasion is not a novelty. And I think that sometimes as historian, we believe that fiscal declarations in the pre-modern period are very proper. Which leads me, in a sense, to a point that you made, Matteo, in your communication as well, which was about the fact that you attributed some of the more upward mobility, if I understood correctly, to the fact that part of this council was chosen by lot. And my question, if you can elaborate a bit more about that, because chosen by lot, yes, but within a set closed groups of potential eligible members. So it's unclear to me how that would work within this closed set. Thank you very much.
Okay, many thanks, Maria. Now is the turn of Salvatore Ciriacono.
Allora, volevo intervenire sulla relazione.
I want to speak about the presentation by Matteo Di Tullio and to ask him the role of manufacturing in a limited agrarian region, Bergamo, for divergencies, social mobility. In case of Bergamo, which is an incredible case for those dealing with the history of Venice, because Bergamo and Brescia, they escape from the Venetian control and they try to find out their own balance. And all this allows me to go back to the general presentations, because the relations are giving important data, or the presentation offering a lot of data for the historical interpretation. But as a modern historian, as I try to be, well now, so that's the beginning of the fun, and we have to interpret her, and this interpretation is very difficult.
Ad aspetti politici.
Going back to political, religious issues, mental issues, and so all this is very important. But what is missing is the final interpretation. We remain stuck in our minds, but the social political reality is very, fragmented, because reactions are so complex, and they escape also to the economic history, if you want. Thank you, Salvatore.
Ecco, il tema che è stato sollevato.
The topic which has been raised by Salvatore Ciriacono makes me also think of a possible comment, because the issue of social mobility, socio-political mobility, well, these effects, this is taking any region into consideration. So any kind of region will be involved for the first early modern era. So the theme of social mobility, this has been chosen. They're happy. This has been chosen, social mobility, as a theme for the Fondazione analysis, because from the history of modern era, the historians of modern era, they recorded everything using different indicators and markers. The restrictions of the access to political power. Also, in literature, I can remember a lovely book wrote by Carlo Dionisotto Stabbato in the 50s, and then translated into Italian by now the publishers. Geography and History of Italian Literature, translated to English. Dionisotto just spoke of a social mobility that grew up from the second half of the 15th century. And around 1540, there was a standstill of this social mobility. And as a marker, as a literature historian, Giannisotti pointed out that the full series of tests through a marker that was the categories shaping social mobility upward. So the ones up, love, affection as indexes, carriers to which all barriers were removed to social mobility, love, affection. And since 1540, Giannisotti just said that in opposition to the category of love, in the Italian literature, there was the category of honor. This was confirmed by a full set of studies that were distinctive in the 60s, starting from Luca di Berengo. Another study is also very important of the Venice region, a sort of oligarchic standstill or closedness. So some social mobility was stopped at the city level, and this paved the way to the shrinkage of the possibility of sharing the power. So it's important to understand if it is also due for the economic processes dynamics. And we would like to know if all the cases submitted here, but for other cases mentioned in the literature, how can this relationship between social mobility, economic mobility, how this economic mobility so translates into power, definition, or attribution. I've been hearing very interesting things this morning, and imagine when we have to read the complete papers, there also will be the read to understand and to provide an answer to the question, how does all that translate? How does this upward mobility translate into urban power management?
Giovanni, now is the turn of...
Thank you, Giovanni. Now we have Marianne Kowaleski, please.
Thank you for a very interesting panel, and I appreciate the focus on methodological issues. I actually think that's very important for a big project like this. So my questions are all methodological. First for Francesco, although this could be asked of any of you, what I'm really curious about is what's missing. So all of you make a nod towards what the problems of your sources are, but you do tend to then surge ahead and get to the final, graphs, ups and downs and the figures like that. So just as an example, taxes on immovables in a place like England, we know leave out 1/2 to 2/3 of the population. How can we talk about social mobility when such a large percentage of the population is not included? Taxes that focus just on households, that's a fiscal fiction, because it doesn't take account of periods of rapid migration, it doesn't take account of life cycle labor service, which you find in the 16th and especially the 17th centuries in rural areas. Taxes can differ. So my question is, how do those absences affect your calculations? Can you calculate the percentage of people or households even who are not in the decima or some of these taxes? Second question is about occupations. Many years ago, I did a lot of work on occupations. I didn't use the coding. I did come up with a coding that was similar. My question here, and the difficulties I had, is how and this goes to Maria's question, that the labels change. What is one, especially in Latin, in one occupation, and you're looking mainly at Italian, but the project is trying to compare regions more widely. Now, I understand that the coding is supposed to be universal, but just as an example, Peloparius in England is a skinner. It is not a tanner. Peloparius early on is a low level. In many towns, it's just, but in London, it's one of the top guilds. It is a completely different type of status and job. Not only that, but within the Skinner's Guild, Peloparius, you will have high-level liverymen who make a lot of money, they get elected as mayors, and then you have low-level yeomen who are just journeymen and never go anywhere. So how do the codes, cope with that particular problem? Because that can be multiplied and start to really affect your data. And then third of all is the problem of political, how you calculate political. So I've done a lot of work with oligarchies, and I'm fortunate to have election returns for towns that are very numerous. But they're all different, so one of the first things you have to do is separate out. In other words, you create categories of political offices. Generally, we say there's an A rank that might be the mayor and the sheriffs or the receivers, and then there's the council below that. And a lot of towns have two councils, so there's a big difference between the councils. Then there's ranks below that. So I was wondering, is that just not a problem? And especially if some of them are chosen by lot, obviously you need to come from a certain social group. There are minimal qualifications to become a counselor. But within that, there's tremendous variations because I have correlated these political ranks with wealth or proxy measures like activity in overseas trade or numbers of servants. And it's very different. And I'm wondering if you have done that exercise and if you think it would make a difference. Thank you.
Thanks. Now is the turn of Jaco Zuderdayan. Please, it's your turn for questions.
Okay, yeah, it is about time that people are murking up the waters here, and I'm afraid I will also try to do this a little bit. I should also say that this is a brilliant project, and I'm very impressed with the results. I have a question specifically for Benedetta, because I was very interested in the take on intra-generational mobility, and I think this is an important topic. However, I also have the feeling that it is perhaps not very likely for people to switch occupational groups, going from being a butcher to being a baker. And I think that recent research, for instance, by Garcia Zuniga and Lopez Loza for Madrid and Baker, Stevenson, Wallace for London, have indicated that there might be more variation in career trajectories within one specific occupation, people going from being an assistant to more of a supervisor, etc. I mean, you can compare it with professors. We start as assistant professors, we become associate professors, full professors, and then if we live long enough, emeriti professors. They would all be labeled as professors in HISCO, I suppose. I hope I'm not making Marco very angry now. But within that group, there is a lot of variation, there's a lot going on. So my question is, did you get any indications within the sources about these specific career trajectories within occupations, and do you see any opportunities to take this into account when thinking about the development of inequality?
Thanks. Now is the turn Julie Claustre.
Sì, grazie mille per il progetto. Ho due domande.
Thank you. Well, I have a couple of questions, a methodological question concerning the project. how to deal with the problems of the same name of
in particular,
homonymy, the issues of the cases of homonymy. This is for Benedetta Crivelli. Well, can we understand why some taxpayers have their position registered and some others no? Why? Is it possible to understand it? Thank you, Gaetano Sabatini. Well, first of all, compliments to the speakers of this morning for having composed, having made up such an interesting picture. From this picture, in my opinion, what emerges is fundamentally the aspect of understanding the role of events which break up tendency in upward and downward mobility. At a first consideration, which we can observe also in other territories in Italy, one only event can be not sufficient, but more than one: wars, epidemics, and concerning the wars, we can also have to consider the topic of the accommodation of the troops. But however, there is an aspect, I think, which I think is interesting, on which I'm asking an opinion to the speakers, and it emerged from the presentation of Mattia Viale, and is the moment in which some forms of new forms of representation emerge on the territory. So the creation of territorial bodies, which we can observe also in other areas in Italy in the 16th century, is a kind of body to which some tax systems correspond. And this is an important distribution system, and also an important factor in the upward and downward mobility. So I'm wondering if also in the other cases observed, there are or not some changing moments of change due to this. Well, all this is strictly linked to the topic of permeability of the municipal bodies to the different social components. Giovanni Muto, who is an expert on this field, reminds us that in the case of the seats in Naples, there are several studies on this, also by Galasso, talking and analyzing exactly the way in which these seats in Naples are reflecting the mechanism, the upward and downward mechanism within the society. But this is a strong element, evermore when we have a new society, new factors in the society. Another question comes from a project some of the Spanish colleagues know. This is a project dedicated to the cases of interrupted upward growth or movement. So these some upward movements which in some way they find some standstill moment. So the researches you presented in these phases focus on aggregate studies concerning some communities, but I'm interested in understanding if something like this has been already highlighted concerning the upward, and downward tendencies, but also the conditions making so that within a group the upward movement is interrupted. Thank you. Now we have Katia. Katia Antunis.
The really nice papers and for the really good data, I think. I would like to try to make sense of what you presented here as a whole. So my questions are for the table and not for one specific presentation. So what I am not sure about, or what I would like to know a little bit more about, if you have the time and the patience, is the problem that you are actually trying to solve upon collecting this data. I think this is essential so that at least we can understand what is the kind of historiographical intervention you want to be making with these specific sources. I think the second point is, how do you canvass the problem? So there's a lot of things happening between the 13th and the 18th century in every society in the world. This is a measurement of the canvassing. Something is happening, and clearly you can translate this into a number and a graph, and there's a line, a very interesting line that decreases from the 13th to the 18th century. We know that. We know that social mobility decreases between the Middle Ages and the early modern period, particularly after the 1720s. We know this. We know this for other areas in Europe. This has been associated with extreme demographic crisis, oligarchization of societies. There's a huge difference between rural areas and the ports, being my question. If you compare these to the ports in the same region, what happens? And then, of course, there's the issue of what you're measuring. You're measuring wealth, if I understand, not income, which means that you're measuring the immobile population and the immobile assets. What does that mean for the results that you're seeing? So, in other words, I would like to hear a little bit more about what are you solving? Why does your specific case study illustrate, illuminate, differs, compares to what we know to other spaces in Europe? And what is the canvassing? So what is happening in these societies whereby these trends are there? I mean, your data shows the trends, right? So what's happening? What justifies these trends? And are we only looking partially at one part of the problem, which is basically going back to Maria's and Marianne's point, what are you not seeing? I would be very curious to know exactly what you're not seeing, because I think you're seeing only a little bit. Not that, I mean, we do with the data we have, I understand that. But if you elucidate what you don't see, I think it will underline the relevance of your data rather than decrease the relevance of your data. Well, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Now, last, Anthony Furiot.
Le mie domande sono per...
My questions are for Francesco Ammannati, but the compliments are for all of you, for Matteo, Guido, for the whole team, for all the speakers of this first session. Compliments as well, both for the results obtained and for the methodology used. It's an extraordinary example of analysis of the sources with methods which, in my opinion, are original, innovative, and also quite refined. However, I have some doubt about some key elements of this methodology. Some of the doubts have been expressed by Marianne and others, and by Julie Kostre about homonymy. My particular doubt
Si fonda il metodo.
is about the link the interfamiliar link from one tax register to the other. From the one side, because a large household can create two units in the next tax register. Above all, taking into consideration the tax system, fragmenting the household asset at each generation, and, if I well understood, in the case in which, when it is not possible to identify the new household representing the main part of the family assets, in case of equitable division of the single independent taxpayers, this link is not considered as valid. So my question is, how many of these links have not been considered as valid? Many of them or a few of them? I would like to know the percentage. And the other question is a bit linked to this first one, and it concerns the geographical mobility. Above all, the renewal of the population from one tax register to the other one, to the next one. So again, in terms of percentage, how many immigrants we have without deaths without descendants, so which disappear in the next tax register, and on the contrary, in the case of immigrants just arrived. In this case, we cannot make the link to a previous household or a subsequent household. So I think it is important to know these two percentages to have the certainty of the results. So this is, as I was saying, is really useful and refined methods, but I think these aspects are very important as well. Thank you.
Thank you for these very interesting questions. So we have to think what's been asked, just to make the methodology more robust now. We can turn over the order of the presentation. Let's start from with Mattia Viale, please. Answers. I am sorry now. Let's consider just the mobile part of the population, at least for the Republic of Venice.
Just the immobile share of the population. At least for the rural areas of the Republic of Venice, this is just partially true. Because if we find some peasants that are moving even for just few months in another community, they are registered in our estimate. And we do find in some communities peasants that are present, let's say, this year, and then we find those people after 5 years, and then they stay there for a while, and then they disappear. So it's true that mostly we just see the residents, this is true, but it's even true that at least for this portion of mobile peasants, we do find them in our sources. So, and for, I mean, it's true, we are not measuring income, we are measuring wealth, but I would say that maybe measuring income, it's even more difficult and tricky if you want to study social mobility, because, I mean, I'm working now on a project on occupational structures and work dynamics in pre-industrial period, and we are basically using the methodology of Ogilvy, and Jane Whittle, Mark Haywood, and Maria Ogren, and basically we see that multiple occupations is a thing in pre-modern societies. So basically reconstructing, building a real income of an household, it's basically, I would not say impossible, but almost. So I would say that this is probably the best approximation of what is social mobility for our period. I mean, yeah, this. I don't know if you agree, but I mean, and then, okay, it's your turn.
Benedetta.
Oh, no, just one last thing on, yeah, sorry, I forgot on the, la creazione dei corpi territoriali e cosa cambia.
The creation of territorial bodies, that's important for the Venetian case. So peasants are much worse with the creation of the territorial body or organ being ruled by the richest families of this area. Also the creation of a judiciary ruled by the district. And we know this very well. With the estimate of the Vicenza regional, is by the creation of this judiciary with some benefits with these magistrates for the rural peasants, where in reality the peasants of Vicenza are worse and worse. Are worse and worse, above all in the research of Bobolo between the 80s and the 90s. And histories of villages where we do see that peasants are miserable, worse and worse. So we have this dynamic between creation of the territorial bodies, clash between contado and city, but also between contados and countrysides. So different types of clashes. Thank you. Microphone, please. So for Milan, the creation of the contado congregazioni after the need of having a general estimate of involving merchants, etc. So we have some worsening of the peasants' condition because because we have these communities being ruled by the richest one. And when I mean breaking down the amount of the tax to pay, so very often they make a translation of the tax. So a tax direct turns out to be different. It's paid in indirect way, increasing levies on consumption levies of duties, which is more aggressive versus the past. Please, Benedetta.
Per quanto riguarda la questione dell'etichetta, diciamo, dell'occupazione e del cambiamento istituzionale di cui parlava Maria Fusaro, effettivamente ci sono una serie di problemi legati anche appunto proprio al Draperius che citava, anche perché nel Cinquecento, quando il Draperius è citato numerose volte negli estimi, quasi mai è un'occupazione isolata, cioè è sempre unita a un'altra occupazione, spesso il tessitore, quindi presumibilmente è una evoluzione quasi di un lavoro tessile di bottega verso un'attività più di gestione, quindi anche diciamo di organizzazione, poi anche appunto come si dice, come lo definisce Tagliaferri, il mercante imprenditore, che poi scompare effettivamente come denominazione. Rimane comunque il mercator lane, quindi comunque il mercante di lane. A quel punto evidentemente c'è proprio un cambiamento anche probabilmente anche della struttura, cioè sicuramente anche della struttura, diciamo anche della lavorazione della lana che deve essere tenuto in conto. Effettivamente bisogna vedere se Draperius e Mercator Lane abbiano effettivamente la stessa identica funzione, anche se poi nella codificazione si tende a inserirlo sotto lo stesso codice. Per quanto riguarda, sì, come si diceva anche appunto, anche per quanto riguarda invece le lavorazioni artigianali, anche lì è molto difficile definire in modo chiaro quali sono, e anche appunto il posizionamento all'interno della filiera poi della produzione, nel senso che e questo si connette anche alla questione della mobilità intragenerazionale. Un tentativo che stiamo portando avanti è quello di utilizzare un altro codice che è l'ISCLAS, che permette appunto di dare, diciamo, anche una gerarchia delle professioni, che però appunto stiamo cercando di adattare alla codificazione ISCO. Effettivamente è molto difficile capire se c'è un passaggio da apprendista a maestro, comunque all'interno, cioè se per quanto riguarda appunto la mobilità intragenerazionale, effettivamente spesso la stessa persona a distanza di 20 anni ha lo stesso identico lavoro. Si può vedere un cambiamento magari nel reddito, e quindi quello può essere una spia di una ascesa anche all'interno della categoria professionale, ma è un lavoro appunto che stiamo ancora portando avanti e che necessita forse di una maggiore attenzione anche al contesto locale, e quindi a una ricerca che in mancanza di fonti secondarie dovrebbe portare appunto a vedere le fonti primarie, per esempio appunto le fonti delle corporazioni, eccetera. Interessante la domanda sul perché alcune professioni sono registrate e altre no. Non ho una risposta. Anche
Also, Tagliaferri, I don't believe is giving a good answer for this issue. I don't know anything else. Very often I notice it in reality. So some identify with the profession. The same person may be in an estimo and not in another estimo, but I don't know. I can't give you an exact answer.
Ecco, grazie.
So, thank you. Sorry for the technical problem for the English speaking participants. So I start from the consideration raised by Katia. So, of course, these days, of course, must be considered in a general framework. The interpretation is the major, canvas of this project. My intervention was about the methodology use and difficulties in using sources and the work in the sources. An additional interpretation is more than welcome, but afterwards, not inside my own research or others' research. That's another step that already began. We're not presenting in the session. Of course, goes without saying. I'm going to answer Salvatore Ciriacono. So data per se, that's the first brick of this wall, to build up this wall of a general processing that has to be explained and also put in certain territorial background or context. And within these several time steps, phases, a territory can experiment. But going back to the methodological problems that have been raised as to sources themselves, I already said something, but I didn't say everything possible. But it's important to understand what's missing, or wealth. So we use wealth and not income. Mattia already said this. So this is partial, more robust than using the concept of income, because for the entire period we studied, is a bit slippery, is a bit tricky. Much better to use wealth than income. So the proxy is good, but sources do not tell everything and do not make the point of the entire wealth of the society, the estimate, the tax registers, even though, so I mean, you provide a general understanding of the possibility of paying taxes. We mean all the wealth components. So, as you can see from the tax revenue declaration by the family leaders, existing for the estimate, these are lands, dwelling houses, immovable assets. In the estimate, so for the cadastre of the 15th century, the latest estimate worked in Florence, as a general test to test the Florence cadastre, trying to register a wider range of assets, movable assets, but also with the calculation of public indebtedness. And this has been studied. These are wealth components totally marginal. And if we don't consider them, the general situation will never change. Something else missing? I don't know. See, tax sources usually do not include those who were not capable in participating in the partition of taxes. The poorest one. So I speak in Florence, and so what's the weight of this? What's the importance of these deficiencies, this lack? We did a lot of attempts to quantify this presence. This belongs to an ongoing study with Guidolfiani, just on the possibility of quantifying everything in such a way to have some indicators of how much this is really missing. Even though something is missing, I take the case, I said for the tithe, but also what's missing is the residence house. So this is impactful. How much is it impactful? We don't know. Already, for studies on inequalities, the result was a bit not so important. The trend was not very much interesting. If you add or subtract, nothing changes. The absolute value changes, but not the trend. The trend does not change. But measuring social mobility, and that's another point. Something missing, but what we're interested in is measuring a certain quantity of wealth, which is kept as such over time. So what matters? No other things show up or disappear. What's important, we have a corpus very compact of wealth, and we see how it's going to be redistributed. When the house of a resident is not included in wealth, so cases such this, they're not meaningful in a way. They're not meaningful. There's no incidence. This, at the level of social mobility measurements, is not meaningfully impactful. Well, another point, methodological homonymy. When we have adjusted to list the households from one estimate and the other, in the thighs, as you've seen, no problem, because the same family, the same taxpayer remains the same during the decades when there is just a switch. A passage of inheritance is easy to understand, not easy, but possible. It's possible to understand how much this wealth is kept as such, or fragmented, or parted. In case of partition, so for social mobility, the link is going to be close. It's not the same household. A new household will begin from the next survey. In case of homonymy, the case of homonymy was very interesting to me. So this was a bit scaring me. Why? Because this is supposed to be a denomination. So this was worrying me. But in reality, if we go and see this data, family names are often reported. So patronymy. So we have homonymy, but in real terms, also as an organization of the fiscal roles, while making the links, quite just a few things. I was doubtful how to join the families from one estimate to the other. You see, the choice of patronymy is not trivial. Links are solid and robust. So the cases of doubtful homonymy that could be invalidate results are just a few cases of homonymy, and also just a few those cases I'm answering to Antonio Furio, cases where the connection is stopped for the partition of inheritance in same parts. This not often happens, and no percentages on these incidents, but this can be done. But this is not meaningful. Just making the average of what you can recall. 2 or 3 cases for each tax register for Estimo. These inheritance are just subject to some petition. And also, we have shown for geographical mobility, we have to understand, according to the available sources, which are the new households included in any survey. This can be explained. Turns out to be a bit difficult. So I mean, it was difficult to find the links. So it was difficult to trend all changes of individual households moving from one community to another. This would be quite difficult to do according to the total group of 1,100 communities of the Contado. I made the sampling already, but finally I was in trouble because it's difficult for the present of 1,100 households. For developable data, what we did is already enough to establish the percentage of migration, mobility within the single communities for which we have these data available now.
Allora, non c'erano state domande dirette a me, però intervengo anch'io nella questione dei patronimi. Ci sono delle differenze anche in base a come gli estimi vengono costruiti, ecco, ce ne sono alcuni che...
So for patronymy, I want to take the floor on patronymy. The case of Castelnuovo, so with some homonymies, a lot of homonymies, but since it's over many years, in some cases, we have also the name of the grandfather, the father, the grandfather, and grandfather. And then we can reconstruct all the family history of these households. The other point, so we wrote on these topics, those who didn't lay down in the Estimo, I'm speaking of Castelnuovo and Tortona. They were just monitoring the landed property. So someone was maybe some notaries. They are very rich, but they seem to be poor, according to some notary deeds. And also in the other case, we have some households that disappear, other families coming in. Now I didn't measure the percentage of these flows, outgoing, ingoing, but if you want, we can do all that. In case of Castelnuovo, I've seen that also families with high percentiles. I said the Bandella family, so famous the Bandella family, in the year of the 1630 plague, they disappear. So they're being killed by the plague, and other will show up later on. So that's a problem that we have to reconsider, and we can do this work, and we can do this analytical work for sure. Yeah, we can do that. Okay, I am just stand that for the same problem because the screen does not allow me to see Alpha Diode. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your suggestions. I do appreciate spurring me to improve my work. Also for the paper which is going to be submitted for the proceedings of this venue, but also for the continuation of our work. Many things already said by Francesco. Going back to a few points of his, stressing this session is dedicated to sources and methods and not to the interpretation. So we just confine ourselves to present sources and the problems, transforming these sources, into a sort of well-grounded analysis. In my case, I made some interpretation assumptions, but this was not my intent. This was not the main target objective of the session this morning. That's why we confined ourselves to that. This said, in the discussion, if you want, now we can go back to this point, and some things we can also be more considered. The first point to highlight, in my view. So the first point I want to highlight is about the issue of sources. What we do see, what we use are just the communal estimates, tax registers, so made by the single fiscal authorities. That's very important to stress this, because what we said about the contados is very important in the distribution of taxation among the several entities of a provincial fiscal jurisdiction. The contados need to distribute taxation in case of the Republic of Venice, taxation levying for Vicenza and the province. But the final distribution of that taxation comes to the individual municipalities for the household. We see the communal tax register not needed to distribute taxation in the several parts of the province, but they want that final define taxation locally. And these can have an incidence in terms of taxation. There's a question. Yes, there's the answer. If the fiscal authority can mediate with the city of Venice, with the town of Venice, they can have just effect on the level of taxation. But in terms of what we observe in communal estimates, no effect may be. So more impactful, and Francesco's right, this estimate has some continuity. Over all these centuries, the rules set up in the Middle Ages, roughly, are kept as such, with minor amendments, changes, till the end of the modern age, when we made studies on inequalities the same. So we couldn't consider these things in the 19th century because sources change. So the source is different from the 19th century, from Piedmont onwards, from Teresiano onwards. We can debate this. Yes, the sources changes, but the estimate, the tax registers have a way of register wealth, which is kept as such over time. So that quoted that amount of wealth, distribute the possibility of moving in terms of wealth within some place, is exactly the same. And that's important to stress. Third point, a bullet point, estimate is not a paradise, it's not an heaven on earth, but that's what we have, first and foremost. Second, careful not to make confusion between wealth and income, considering these as two different sides of the coin, because they're also interconnected. Estimate do not register properties, possessions, immovable assets, but also they register everything these immovable assets have. So payables and liabilities, all this recorded in the estimate. Each property or his household or his property has a value along with what we can do. And in many cities, Bergamo is one of these cases. Francesco said the Tuscan case. So maybe we have some quantifications, approximative quantifications of what can be defined as the art capital. We have some approximations. In addition to immovable assets, also we have some value as to the art capital. But this amount, art capital, is irrelevant vis-à-vis the value coming from the immovable assets or properties. So wealth, income, that's a troublesome issue. We can't face this issue today, too much troubling us. This said, bear in mind that I believe estimate is a very good tool to use to try and make this analysis with all the possible limitations in this case. That's an incredible tool considering a full set of stuff needed, but, of course, we have to understand which is the final objective to achieve. Katja and Tunis has said, which is the target of our research study. The objective, maybe it's up to you, Guido, to talk, but I'm talking in your place. Maybe the target is measuring this process, the first target, objective, try and measuring social mobility, getting out of this narrative. Historiography put available to us since we have cancelled mobility in such a way goes down. So the challenge to me, so the approach was the one to try and measure this mobility, try and quantify it. So, yes, the level of the flowchart I've shown on Bergamo, the swings of social mobility in terms of access to the council in 15th, 16th century. Yes, this could be seen. That's visible from this third chart. But if you consider this as such, compared to the beginning of the 16th or 15th century, we understand the level is far away. There's a gap. So trying to measure and to give an order of magnitude seems to be the main objective, the order of magnitude of this phenomenon. So as to some specific questions, so so appointed by lot in some councils, we speak of Piacenza. I'm not an expert of Piacenza. You should ask Marzio Romani, which is the rule for this drafting. So Piacenza, we have this modality, we have this turnover. I think that's the drafting. So from all the citizens, for having the citizenship, not just the most powerful or the most economic and robust, but we have to be quite cautious at this point. Okay, so for the local specific contest, and I go back to Salvatore Ciriacono's question, yes, that's important indeed. In my presentation, I tried to provide you some coordinates. Roughly, for the bergamasco contest, the local contest really matters. One of the answers I give for the Bergamo case, Bergamo is a city where the mercantile class, financial class, has a function. It's minor, but minor function, because we have a problem of these valleys. So in a certain way, this justify some level of mobility in terms of access to council and also in terms of wealth, lower versus other cities of the Per Valley, because the comparison can be this. And now I go back to the question raised, the observation raised by Giovanni Muto. Yes, of course. This is the next step to go. Try and see and try to understand how the closeness on the limitation of mobility in terms of access to political offices. This is having an effect or is going to coincide with the economic mobility. My judgment, my impression, we speak of judgments, impression due to the state of current research, is that during the modern age period, the fact that the new economic and Italian groups have some troubles, hardly join the municipal councils, as they did instead in the second half of the 15th century. So maybe during the early era or period, in case of Bergamo at least, families, the economically upward families, they cannot join the council unless their ancestors were present in the council. Maybe they're not interested in joining the municipal council, but that's a suggestion. One of my many suggestions. That's a mere suggestion. For homonymy and the link, okay, the answer has been already provided. Patronymy is key in order to fix the problem of homonymy. Another important element is to see where the household is located in the city. We got division by districts, very useful, because households they meet, and we can find families using districts. In case of Mattia, in my own case, when we can pick up the initial and final date of serving, the annual swings of variation, that's great. It's not a problem, because it's the same estimate defining the stay of a family or a household, the same as which is the household in question, because I mean, observation just rank one after the other. Well, I think I said everything. I've no cases of stopped ascent or upward mobility. Gaetani Sabatini was asking this, very, very interesting, but I have no case of an interrupted or stopped upward mobility case. I'm sorry if my answers are a bit blurred, confused, but I got the feeling I answer all the questions asked to me. Thank you.
Beh, grazie quindi a tutti.
Thank you all the speakers for these presentations, rich and very challenging presentation this morning. And qualified, I thank also the audience for timely questions asked that have shown absolutely the importance of sources. Please allow me to close this meeting, this session, morning session, also defining a few points, not for the audience, because the audience is made up of distinguished, scholars and specialists, but I want to recall for the entire audience, I want to say that this type of knowledge of history on sources, debating the sources, this is something incredible, because the disseminated history with political clashes, that's different. This is focused on opinions, views, consideration. So these are two different histories. So independently from what has been said, so source-based history comes first, in my view. So we have to reiterate these concepts. When we try to construct a sort of aware scientific knowledge, safeguarded memory, and the function of economic stories, where scientists, academic professionals, but we have a political and civic function, very important indeed.
Crucialità.
Everything is crucial. We have to verify sources. We have to see if the source is just very well linked with some research on some knowledge. So it's not just our legacy, our patrimony. We should rather share with the rest of the world. People should know these sources. So outside this organization or events like ours, the thing has been organizing these events since ever. The importance of sources opening up to financial education, the attempt of making people understand more and more, new generation should know more and more. So this, for history, we have primary sources. And primary sources are important. So we have to recall our civil functions. Our history is not one unique history or unique truth. Ours is a scientific process. Guido's project, the new scholars or students' project is something new, making our discussion progress. Now we are more aware of this, and science proceeds this way. Democratic or idiosyncratic science, undoubtedly, that's the way science goes on. I want to recall the statutes of the historians must have and must confirm. And I want to close this session mentioning my own anonymous, Don Giuseppe De Luca, a priest, my anonymous, a case of anonymity. The title makes the difference in Italy, not in Spain. So sources are for the historians, he said, and glaciers are for rivers. So without source, no way to make history. Thank you a bunch, and have a nice lunch.
Bravissimi, complimenti.